there for a second, and Felicity would have felt no different. "Do you know her?" Abigail Winters turned her head to her. "You have mentioned that the London literary scene is often as small and tight-knit as a village." "I have heard of her," Felicity said, carefully. Her mouth was dry. "You have not met her?" "Maybe once or twice. Her star was on the decline by the time I had reached some success." "I wonder if these events had something to do with each other." Fear, sharp as a needle. Nausea, that had nothing to do with an empty stomach. Head spinning. She could not know. Mrs. Winters could not know. She was, by her own admission, quite marooned in the quietude of the countryside. Indeed, that was one of the reasons she had invited Felicity for the summer in the first place. But what if it was not true? What if she was well appraised of some things indeed, and her invitation was not a blithe kindness, but a subtle cruelty? An attempt to show her stepson just how right he had been to discard his unsuitable connection. This blind terror lasted a few heartbeats, each spawning more wild theories than the last. Then, however, Felicity forced herself to breathe slowly to calm down. Abigail Winters was a woman as far removed from Machiavellian schemes as it was possible to be. Besides, what would have been the point of such a game? Would it not have been easier and more sensible to simply refrain from the invitation, allowing Felicity and Mr. Winters to orbit their own planets in peace? They would not have met again in that case. "Miss Deacon, are you quite all right?" Edmund Winters asked her, watching her with attention and almost a palpable worry. "Of course," Felicity managed to say. "I have never been better." "Are you sure? You are rather pale." "I have never thought artistic rivalry could be such a mighty force," Priscilla Cadogan chimed in. "If the mention of Miss Miles distresses Miss Deacon so, I promise to refrain from talking about other poets in the future." This young woman was just incapable of not delivering a stab when someone's flank was open, it seemed. "Your concern touches my heart," Felicity said dryly, looking at her. "I think it might be better if I leave your company for a while," she told Mrs. Winters. "That would be a shame. Are you sure you are not unwell?" "Perhaps a touch. I might need some fresh air." As soon as she was out of the house, Felicity broke into a run. The clouds above were heavy as pearls with the coming rain, and she wanted to reach the lavender cottage before the world became awash with water. But she was not going to lie to herself. The fresh air and the honest energy of running felt good. Her heart was still beating fast. She grew tired very fast and felt a sharp pain in her side. Felicity smiled bitterly, continuing her way in fast steps. Was it really such an eternity since she used to gaily run around her parents' Somerset house, and with a hoop at that? Not that such exercises were possible for a woman grown, not even according to her mother, who did care about her figure. But no one would have forbidden her to take walks, even in London. She seemed to have spent too many years in the sickly world of sedan chairs. Halfway to the cottage, Felicity turned and looked at the pale edifice of Morwood Hall, rising not far in the distance. Life was going on beyond those windows. The Cadogans were, no doubt, still taking tea with the Winterses. Mr. Winters was, most likely, setting his cap on Miss Cadogan, now that the uncomfortable presence of his guest was no more. He was most likely relieved at the restoration of decorum, whatever the solicitousness in his eyes. Felicity swallowed, turned back, and continued on her path toward the cottage. "You seem to be very worried about the coming rain," Sir Jonathan remarked mildly as he traced the direction of Edmund's gaze. The direction that led to the window. It was blasted nonsense. Edmund knew that well. After all, Miss Deacon was probably suffering from nothing more than a moment's indisposition, or even just some unwelcome memory prompted by Miss Cadogan's words. But he did not want Felicity Deacon to suffer from either. This protective impulse was no different to what he ordinarily felt toward young women with no husband or father to shield them, Edmund told himself. On the other hand, he was not sure he was feeling any such impulse toward Priscilla Cadogan right now. He glimpsed Miss Deacon's figure down in the darkening gardens. It was madcap, but he wanted, for a second only, to run after her. It was a desire as natural as the one that propelled him out of the house and over the fields and wild forest paths, a desire that was the extension of his heart. Edmund? His stepmother called his name softly. At this, the spell was broken. He had guests, he had responsibilities, he had a bride to win. Edmund looked back at Sir Jonathan. "Forgive me, my lapse," he said with an effort. "I was only wondering about the weather." Chapter 8. "Oh, I don't know, Miss Deacon," Mrs. Kerr's daughter said doubtfully. "I sew some things here and there, but I've never made a proper ball gown. I don't know if I can do something with those hoop petticoats and—" "Don't worry about that," Felicity replied, sitting at the table in the small farmhouse where the Kerrs now lived. The house was no hovel. The trade in the shop was probably going well. Felicity even saw some watercolours on the walls. But one frame, the one Felicity had to turn around to see, and she was not altogether sure it was not placed out of the way on purpose, was empty. Either it was awaiting a pretty picture brought up on the turnpike road from the workshops of Covent Garden, or the picture had recently been sold. "Don't worry at all," she repeated. "No one wears hoop petticoats these days but ladies of the court. Natural lines and a short bodice is the order of the day, and this year, short sleeves." "That's good. For you, I mean. You won't have to spend so much on fabric," Jane reasoned. "But wouldn't it be, a little bit wanton in the looks of it?" "Not at all. I suppose the lady who first brought the fashion for these robes over from France was a royal mistress at one point, but years have passed since then. Nowadays the highest ladies of the land dress this way without incurring any reproach." Before yesterday's visit, Felicity's reason for accepting the invitation to the Winters' ball had been a mix of politeness and curiosity. Now, however, she was quietly enraged to the point of her blood boiling. Devil take Priscilla Cadogan, and she, Felicity, would rather let the devil take her own self than give the heiress any reason to suppose she was hiding from her. It went against every rule she had learned over these last years. Making an enemy out of the only daughter of the local grandee was not the wisest course of action for anyone, let alone a woman who wanted to be beloved of the ton and had neither birth nor fortune to achieve it. But Felicity had once allowed another grandee to run her out of Morwood Hall. She hadn't shown her face there for an eternity as a result. Mr. Winters the elder was dead and cold in his grave beyond her reach, but the Cadogans were alive and well. She was not going to let them drive her away with their scorn the way he had done. "I suppose, Miss Deacon," Jane said doubtfully, "we could do something with that. If only you draw the silhouette for me. What are these gowns usually made of? I don't think Mother has any proper silk in her shop." "Muslin, most commonly." "I don't think she has any Indian muslin either." The regret in the young woman's voice was palpable. "A local one would be perfectly good," Felicity said quickly. "It's not as though our spinning mules are in any way inferior. Besides, I am going to a country ball, not being presented to Her Majesty." "Have you been presented to Her Majesty?" Jane's eyes gleamed with lively curiosity. Felicity couldn't help but smile at that. Jane Marsden, née Kerr, would have thought she was living the life of impossible glamour down in the capital. To her credit, plenty of people far more well-informed thought the same. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Marsden. I don't have a great lady who could sponsor my presentation. Besides, I doubt there would be much point. Young ladies who go through their debut do so to find fine husbands, and I have little chance of that." "Oh, don't say such things, Miss Deacon. You're not exactly pretty," Jane said frankly, "but so alive, and so well dressed, and Mother says you know so many things." "That last one is not always a good thing in the eyes of some gentlemen, I suppose. My husband's not like that. He never said a word about my borrowing things from the circulating library as long as they're not novels. He says a clever mother will bring up clever children." "That's very reasonable of him. Felicity thought, unbidden, of Edmund Winters. When he was to marry, his children would be brought up by tutors and governesses. Their mother's knowledge, or the lack of it, would play little role in it. However, he had never been against her borrowing tomes from his father's venerable, unused library, even though sometimes her interest in the matters exceeded his. If Miss Cadogan would one day be struck with the desire to read Pope's translation of the Iliad, her husband was unlikely to object. Priscilla Cadogan would be a happy woman one day, Felicity thought, with a sudden yearning. It's pain as pulling a toothache. It's a shame she clearly did not realise it. "Have you been sewing for a long time, Miss Marsden?" Felicity asked, to change the subject. "As long as I can remember. I've always been inventing little things for my younger sisters, and sometimes helping the neighbours with frocks, especially after father opened his shop. But I've never dressed a lady for a ball. That would be a challenge." The last words were said not with trepidation, but, on the contrary, a kind of anticipation. "But I suppose you are fairly well known among the local ladies." Naturally, someone like Abigail Winters doubtless had a mantua maker in Bath, if not in London, but someone like, for instance, the local vicar's wife could not possibly afford such extravagance, and Jane was probably a better option than many by far. "I wouldn't call myself well known," the woman demurred. I just lend a hand, and that's usually with mending, rather than a creation from the whole cloth, as it were." Felicity smiled at her. Likely an unplanned pun, and Jane hesitated, then smiled in return. "I could help you," Felicity suddenly said. "I may not be the literary lioness as some paint me as, but I am, as it were, fairly well known in some circles too. I could praise to anyone who would care to listen, be it in Bath or in London itself." "Surely you don't mean that?" "Of course I do." Suddenly Felicity found herself annoyed with the world, and with her playing part in it. She recalled the clever quips of her friends and rivals, sharp political jokes about the treaty and the war exchanged over a dinner table like darting needles. Here, however, was a woman the very flesh of whose life had been affected by both. Her husband never quite coming back whole after the war, the crops of their farm never quite selling for any decent price since the signing of the treaty. She, Felicity, might have fumed at Edmund Winters for dishonouring their affinity years ago, but at least he was doing something to help his tenants. What was Felicity doing but writing down her observations of flowers and bees, in the hope it might spur her on to produce yet more verses on improbable, tragic romances? "I want to help you," Felicity explained. I want to do something true and particular and material as the earth under our feet. Would you allow me to help you?" "Of course. Oh, I'd be so grateful if your plan works." There was, of course, this little if. If her plan works. If the standing that would have allowed her to execute it would not take a plunge in the next few months, which it might well, if no improbable tragic romances would be forthcoming. But Felicity was going to cross this bridge when she came to it. "I am sure it will," she said firmly, trying to convince herself as much as she did the woman sitting at the table opposite her. "At least I'm going to do my utmost to make sure it will." "It is quite in your fashion," his stepmother observed, "to be late to the ball in your own house." "Forgive me," Edmund said crisply. "I had to finish writing some letters." "Something to do with those oaks?" "Elms, mother. The oaks take too long to grow to any useful height, and are therefore unsuited for the purpose. I beg you not to address these words to any woman but me tonight." As his gaze roamed the ballroom, Edmund could not help but agree that his stepmother and Miss Deacon succeeded where he would have likely failed, if only, as he sternly reminded himself, because he did not care for the frivolous. Some of the additions around him were doubtless his stepmother's idea. The heavy French girandoles, for instance, carrying 8 wax candles each. The draperies of dramatic blue velvet that framed the windows for the night were Miss Deacon's notion. He knew it because he had heard her express it, back on the summer day when the ballroom was empty and she was flitting about like a dark-haired sprite, talking of Aeolian harps. The Aeolian harp was there too, of course, a new addition to the salon. This was not the room where most guests tonight were to congregate, and yet, according to Miss Deacon, they were sure to pass it and take note. Edmund thought it a lot of trouble for very little worth, but rebuffing her advice was somehow beyond his powers. Perhaps the ties of affection that bound them all those years ago still tethered him to her, together with a more insidious coil of guilt. Edmund shook his head, stepping forth into the fray. He had little to feel guilt over in that whole affair, had he? These thoughts, they had to be banished for good, especially tonight, when he was supposed to be overawing Miss Cadogan with his hospitality and gallantry. He could spot her now, an angelic vision of white satin and Spanish silver, waiting demurely with the other ladies. Miss Deacon, however, he could not see. Perhaps she was busy, just as he had been. After all, as he could recall from her prodigious output, she was as much of a busy bee as he was himself, with the added factor that, unlike him, she had to work for her bread. She might still be in the lavender cottage now, polishing her old lines or inventing new ones. Before he could finish the thought, however, there was a sound from the doors, footsteps, the rustling of gowns, curious whispers. Then the sea of satin parted, and Edmund saw Felicity Deacon. She walked fast, without the mincing grace of the daughters of the local gentry. She was taller than them too, which was obvious now that he saw her among them. And among the sea of white, she was wearing purple. No flounces there, no. Whatever that lace his stepmother once told him about was called Calvinist lace, Huguenot lace. There was only the simple and bright expanse of purple, draping itself over her as though she were a Roman matron in her stola, caught beneath her bosom. Her sleeves were short, and the expanse of her creamy white arms was naked to the eye. Among the pale daisies of the ballroom, she was an orchid. He was not the only one to notice that, as was clear. An older man than him started to move in her direction, his intentions clear. The musicians, after all, had just started a lively tune that Edmund himself had learned only recently. Felicity Deacon did not notice the older man. Smiling, she approached Miss Cadogan, clearly wishing to greet the nigh only young woman in the ballroom she knew. In response, Miss Cadogan passed her by, her face studiedly averted as though they had never met, or met under circumstances that were best forgotten. The cut was clear. So was the hurt on Miss Deacon's face. So was the new hesitation in the older gentleman's steps. It was one thing to desire the acquaintance of a lovely stranger. It was another to approach someone whom the daughter of a great landowner saw fit to cut. Edmund looked at Priscilla Cadogan, pristine in her white satin, her profile cold. Then at Miss Deacon, bright as a flower on fire. The prudent thing to do would have been to follow the former, the respectable, desirable bride. But by God Almighty, would this prudent thing be the right thing too? Gritting his teeth, Edmund turned away for Jonathan Cadogan's daughter. Let her find her bridegroom in Hades. Coldness he could forgive, but he could never abide deliberate cruelty. There was only one salve he could apply to Miss Deacon's unenviable position. He crossed the room in quick, broad strides, the strides of a man more used to paths than to ballrooms, and reached her. "Miss Deacon," Edmund raised his voice for all to hear, "you are truly beautiful tonight. Would you do me the honour of granting me the next dance?" Felicity Deacon looked shocked. Then her cheeks flushed with delight, and her eyes sparkled like black jewels. "I would be glad to, especially since it's the very dance I told you about." That part was not obvious straight away, for the strains of music produced by professional musicians, of course, differed greatly from the humming Miss Deacon gave him as an example. "Moll in the wad?" "Exactly." She took his offered arm, and they took their place in the row of couples. "I have to warn you, Miss Deacon, I did not say I am good at it." "It is no problem at all. I am sure you are an apt pupil." That way of putting it was very optimistic. Edmund recalled their lesson in the empty room weeks ago, and also tried his best to copy the movements of the men around him, with more aptitude for fast dances than he had. Miss Deacon, however, was splendid, and it was not only the years of affection, for these were indeed years, as he understood now, the feeling not so much abandoned as buried, that led him to think so. She was sprightly and quick, her silver-stockinged ankles flashing gaily as the hem of her gown rose an inch or two during some particularly daring jump. "You've saved me," Miss Deacon whispered, her face flushed, as they finished drawing the first star-shaped figure on the floor with their feet. "Thank you." Perhaps it was the exhilaration of the dance, or the gilded excitement of the evening, or perhaps the sheer loveliness of her, that prompted Edmund to reply, his voice just as low, "I should have saved you a long time ago." Her lips parted, and in her eyes flashed the last thing he had expected to see there now. Fear. "How did you know I wanted saving? What from?" Her voice was merry. Her voice was trembling. "From want, of course," Edmund replied, confused. "From need." She spun on her toes, a whirlwind of muslin, and when she turned back to him again, her smile was genuine. "You should have," Miss Deacon said with brazen ease that would have been startling in anyone else. "But I forgive you, Mr. Winters." He could feel 100 pairs of eyes upon them, and normally he would have resented being so watched by people, especially since half the people here he barely knew, and the other half he wished he barely knew. But right now it seemed strangely right. A solemn moment requires witnesses, after all. "Edmund," he said, "I would be grateful if you could call me Edmund again." They joined hands and slipped down the middle. It was centuries away from running in the grass as they did as children. For one thing, back then they rarely cared about the elegance of the whole movement, but their hands used to be conjoined in just the same way. "I will do that." Miss Deacon looked breathless and blooming and unutterably beautiful. "Provided you are going to call me Felicity." Chapter 9. Felicity awoke late the next morning. In fact, it would have been rather generous to call it morning. The sun was already perilously high in the sky. She smiled upon her pillow, upon her own momentary self-indulgence, and other things. In London she took pains to cultivate the appearance of silken ease and infinite leisure, but in fact she usually rose very early and worked on barely a breakfast. Now, however, was a special case, she reasoned, and not simply because the ball ended so late into the night. The world had turned on its axis. Something impossible had happened. Edmund Winters had chosen her. Not as a future bride, of course, she was not conceited or deluded enough to think that, but as a dear friend he preferred to the woman he actually was of a mind to make his fiancée only one night past. They were Edmund and Felicity once more. The laws of time had been overturned. Still in her nightgown, humming a theatrical tune, Felicity went to another room. Yesterday was the day of the week she usually received her post here. Yesterday was also a day completely consumed by last-minute preparations, and therefore she promised herself to deal with her correspondence later. Infuriatingly, the small business of the day refused to simply evaporate, however enchanting the night, and sure enough, there was still a small heap of letters lying on the desk. The top one was from Mr. Flight. Felicity sighed, guessing at its contents, but even this unwelcome intrusion into her Somerset idyll could not ruin her good mood today. The one nestling beneath it was much shorter, and thus Felicity unfolded its single sheet first. The handwriting was unknown to her. Perhaps it was a note from some literary admirer who found her even in her summer seclusion. Such letters could be exceedingly silly sometimes, and yet Felicity was a woman of flesh and blood, and she would have lied if she said she was not at the very least a little warmed by them. She started reading. "Dear Miss Deacon, I am surprised that you, literary lioness that you are, have decided to abandon your London lair for the depths of Somerset. Such behaviour hints either at a sudden change of heart or a less sudden desire for concealment, and knowing something of your character, I strongly suspect the latter. Felicity's heart sank. It was one of those letters, then. Well, she would have lied too if she said it was the first time she received a poison pen. Due to the circumstances with which you are no doubt familiar, I find myself in Bath. I wonder if you might be curious enough to visit me there. You will find the address in the postscript. I suspect we have more than enough to say to each other. The letter was signed simply C. Miles. Felicity had to sit down. The sunlit day outside might as well have been raining on another planet. Claire Miles, after all these years. Felicity recalled the scene that greeted her in that small withdrawing room in Hampstead. She wished she could bury it forever. But that was impossible. No memory was truly dead, not even if every person featured in it was 6 feet under. And Claire Miles, it seemed, was still very much walking the earth. Explaining to Mrs. Winters that she was going to Bath for a day or two was not a difficult thing. In fact, the older woman told her she was surprised Miss Deacon had not done so sooner. After all, a worldly creature like her must have been bored in the green quietude of their lands and hungering for the excitement of the town. Excitement? Felicity smiled at that, and her smile was brittle. Perhaps that was one word to describe what she felt. The streets of Bath were gaiety and satin and sedan chairs, as always. This was, after all, what the fashionable circles called the season, and not everyone could afford a turn in London. Besides, ladies and gentlemen of ample means and frail health enjoyed the waters and the card parties of this place as usual. But theirs was not the world Felicity was aiming for. Not today, at any rate. The address Claire Miles had given her was noticeably far from the good inn where Felicity stayed, even in terms purely geographical. In terms of the means and the circumstances, the place was galaxies away. Felicity regretted that she had no habit to perfume her handkerchiefs, for the smell in the street was decidedly unwholesome. In London terms, this was not quite St. Giles, but certainly a rookery a good number of steps below Russell Square. The house that corresponded to the address and the description had clearly once been a city mansion of some local grandee, built before Bath attracted the royal attention, and with it the noble and the moneyed clientele from far away. Felicity wouldn't have been surprised if someone had told her that royalists used to gather here in the days of Oliver Cromwell, in a world more violent than that Robert Adam ever knew. Those days were long past, however, and the glory of the address with them. Now the house was clearly subdivided into rooms to let, and, judging by the grey laundry hanging out on the window-sills to dry, not to mention the smell, ran rather sloppily. Gingerly, Felicity walked through the door. No one prevented her from doing so. She might as well have been coming to murder Claire Miles in her bed for all they knew. There was a brief period in her life when she and her mother lived in a place like this, if not for long. Felicity had been as eager as her mother was to climb out of there. She accepted the cup willingly, and had no one to blame for forcing the contents down her throat. It was only that she did not know how deep the cup would be, how bitter the dregs. Flimsy doors responded to her touch, parting easily like meat to the contact with a sharp knife. In some rooms she saw nothing but emptiness, and some meagre furniture. Here the former ballroom with fine plaster peeling off the walls. Here what used to be a withdrawing room, now a home to a bed and a child's cot. Sometimes she saw faces looking back at her, not so much indignant as curious, or simply numbly tired. The ground floor, the first, the second. A sordid Pilgrim's Progress. No sign of Claire Miles. There was only one flight of stairs left, one that led to the attic. Felicity hesitated before it. Partly it was mere disbelief. Was that woman really in such dire straits right now that she could only afford the cheapest room even in a place such as this. She used to be a veritable toast of the town. Perhaps she, Felicity, had simply missed something during her search below. Partly, it was a simple animal fear. She had always been afraid of dark spaces, of the basements and the attics, where old ghosts lurked. But sooner or later one had to face them. If she turned and fled now, the ghost would still be there, its shroud whispering secrets. Felicity took a deep breath and ascended the stairs. In the days gone by, the attic must have been where the maids of the house slept. It had not undergone much change in the centuries that passed since, even though some of the damp decay that was set in the rest of the house could be felt in the air now. The woman who had written the letter that surprised Felicity and sucked the joy out of the summer day was standing in the middle of the room. Claire Miles was not tall, had never been tall, but there was something imposing in her presence, nonetheless. She was wearing an old but incongruously expensive gown of gentle lilac colour, as though she was still the literary equivalent of a debutante, a girl genius, a brilliant protégée. Felicity did not need to inspect the stack of books piled up on the bedside table. She had read most of them, back when her own star was not quite in ascendancy, and she wanted to study the works of those she thought her betters. She knew Miss Miles was the author of every single tome, every single poetic anthology kept there. "Miss Deacon," the older woman greeted her, "you look wonderful, but then you always have. I see you no longer wear gowns that bare your ankles." "I'm not an adolescent any more. Only girls who have not yet come of age wear such short skirts. Don't be so hard on yourself. Courtesans wear them too. I would have offered you to sit down, only there is only one chair here." With this, Claire Miles sat in it, as though she were a schoolmistress, and Felicity the troublemaker in front of her. "Why have you called me here?" Felicity asked. "To inform you of something, Miss Deacon. You have been flaunting your sins too publicly, and at my word they might become very public indeed." "I have no notion what it is you're talking about." "I know about your yearly sojourn in a certain seaside town. I know its reason. I know your companion." "You know nothing." "I know more than you can imagine. I might not have much money, no, never have, not even in the best of times, but I still have connections. Not to mention I have eyes and ears of my own and a working brain too. I have it all here." She tapped on her forehead. "Names, times, dates. The scandal sheets are going to be absolutely thrilled to hear them all." "I highly doubt that," Felicity said as lightly as she could, which was not much. "I am no heiress, no grande dame. My comings and goings are not of interest to many. Of course you are no grande dame. If you were, people would have been simply thrilled by these comings and goings. The ton lives according to its own laws, especially those ladies belonging to it who are both rich and married. But you are neither, Miss Deacon. You are living on the edge of ruin. I know that because so did I once. I can guarantee there are already people wondering just how autobiographical your poems about passionate, flesh-killing passion are. That is a flimsy base for any construction. Once they know what I do, it is going to be flimsy no longer." "What do you want from me?" "I want money." At this, Felicity laughed. "All this Gothic display, and for such a tawdry girl. Oh, Miss Miles, it is a wonder you went out of fashion. You always knew how to create an atmosphere." At this taunting, Miss Miles's expression became a mask of rage. "You know very well why I went out of fashion, you light skirt. You were there. You were the instrument of that." "I was nothing of the kind. I was simply another bauble to interest your patron." "Tell that to someone utterly stupid. I know a flirt when I see one, and I certainly know a schemer." Oh, there was a schemer in that story, except it was not me. "I don't have ready money now. I am a patient woman, Miss Deacon. I can wait." Chapter 10. When Felicity finally arrived home, she sat at the desk without changing, her light summer coat still buttoned tightly against her chest. She had had hours of the journey to think on what had just happened, of the dangers now hanging over her. Claire Miles. God! She was sure the woman was long since dead, or abroad, or simply dissolved in the teeming masses of people in the capital where she had once made her career. Her all-too-brief career. Felicity's own career, of course, could turn out to be just as brief, especially if she didn't pay. She raised her eyes, gazing out into the garden, the green grounds, the faint white of Morwood Hall glowing on the summer's day somewhere beyond. It was so close, so seemingly close. But the distance between her and that house might as well have been the miles between distant stars right now. Felicity imagined, for a second, rising from her desk, walking to the home of her patroness, to Edmund's house, explaining what happened, asking for help. Telling the truth. But God, what an ugly truth it was going to be. Too ugly for the Axminster carpet of their lovely withdrawing room. She was going to be thrown out of the place like a misbehaving cur, or rather, politely escorted out, for the second time in her life, and this time there would be no miraculous return. Shaking her head, Felicity lowered her eyes once again. No, that was not the solution. If there was a way to raise money to pay the blackmailer, she was going to have to accomplish that on her own. Perhaps it was the necessity gripping her throat, or perhaps the old exhaustion. But the ideas refused to come. Her imagination might as well have been a plain of scorched earth, left once the marauding armies had departed. Felicity closed her eyes. There should have been a way to free her from that grasp, to calm her nerves and relax her limbs, if nothing else. A thought struck. She was quite sure that she had just this kind of solution among the things she took with her when she came to Morwood Hall in the first place. Strictly speaking, it was a medicine for a cold. Felicity knew she was rather prone to throat aches, even during the hot summer months, and took some with her just in case. But it contained enough laudanum for it to work. Felicity poured herself a glass of water and measured a few dark-coloured drops out of the small bottle. Then, thinking better of it, she added a couple more drops to the liquid. And one more, just to be sure. Edmund could not quite wait for Miss Deacon to come back from her sojourn to the circulating libraries of Bath. At least he had assumed those were her primary destination. The few days she had remained in the city of the healing waters could not have been enough to participate in any sort of social engagements. He told himself such hurry is unseemly as he walked down the garden path. After all, it might well be Miss Deacon's hasty departure after the ball was precipitated specifically by his forwardness during. But, his inner voice murmured, it might not have been. Edmund Winters found himself nervous as a schoolboy around his first infatuation. He would have said so, at least, had he not realised that, as an actual schoolboy, he had never suffered from infatuations of any sort. There was the intense friendship with Miss Deacon, back then a simple Felicity. Then there was a long period of nothing but talk, the usual adolescent talk of boys who thought they knew more about ladies than they actually did. Then the staid, slow courtship of Miss Cadogan. But that courtship was now over for good. Even if Priscilla Cadogan herself could forgive a man who snubbed her during a ball where she was supposed to be an unofficial guest of honour, her father never would. Now the only road in front of him led to Felicity Deacon's door, and Edmund had never felt gladder before, and never before had his step been lighter. She did not open immediately. When she did, he saw she was still dressed in her morning garments, despite the sun being already high in the sky. "Miss Deacon, I've heard you have come back from Bath." She smiled a strange, dreamy smile. "So I have." "May I come in?" Miss Deacon took a pause before answering. When she looked into his eyes, Edmund was momentarily entranced by her glittering dark gaze, until he noticed that her pupils were wider than ever before. "Miss Deacon," Edmund asked cautiously, "are you quite well?" "Never better." She giggled. "Oh, I feel so light." "Have you been suffering from a toothache?" "What?" "I have seen the effect of laudanum before, Miss Deacon. My mother's teeth ache often, as does her head. It's the remedy she prefers. Besides, there is quite a lot of the concoction in the tonics against the cold." "Oh!" Felicity Deacon turned around several times, as though she were a star moving around her orbit. "No, not a toothache, just a heartache, I suppose." "I could summon our family physician," Edmund said, feeling more and more awkward with every passing second. At this, Miss Deacon laughed, and her laughter was like sparks dancing in the air. "I don't need a physician, Edmund," she replied, calling him by his Christian name. No, the name she had not used since they were both children. "Besides, you have promised to call me Felicity from now on." "You remember that?" "Of course I do," she said with quiet tenderness. "How can I not?" He took a step toward her, wanting, for a second, nothing so much as to take her hand between his and feel the beating of her heart in her wrist. "Felicity." "Edmund, I don't know what to do." "What happened?" "I cannot tell you." "Please do," he urged her. "I cannot imagine there is anything I cannot help you with." "You would not want to help me if you knew the truth." Felicity stumbled in her half-conscious rotations, and Edmund caught her without thinking. "I cannot imagine that. Unless you have been secretly hunting people in the rookeries of London." "Edmund Winters, have you just made a joke?" "It seems so." Edmund smiled, despite feeling more and more disturbed with every second. "I am a bad influence on you." "A benevolent one, you mean?" She shook her head slowly, as though she were moving underwater, drifting away from him. "Do you know what might help me?" "What?" "If I never have to go back."
"To London?"
"To Margate."
"Margate? The seaside resort?"
Edmund was perplexed. What on earth would she be doing in Margate, especially against her will? Felicity nodded. "I don't want to. I cannot do this any more."
"No one is going to force you."
Edmund spoke heatedly. He had very little idea of what she was talking about. He sensed something profoundly wrong, however, a dead body under the calm surface of a lake, a ghost in the dark. "They will, Edmund. They will."
"Who are they? Felicity," he urged her. "Tell me."
But she said nothing. It was as though something changed in her in a trice, and the dreamy exuberance morphed into a sullen, complete lack of spirit. Edmund remained with her for a while. Then she simply wandered away through the rooms, as though he were not there, and lay upon the sofa, gazing into the empty air in a kind of stupor. By then, Edmund had already taken the decision. It was time for him to do some travelling of his own. Chapter 11. When Felicity opened her eyes, her throat was dry, and the world beyond the window was the faint grey of early morning. She felt rather supine, and continued lying there until the golden scythe of dawn cut through the clouds. Then, massaging the vision into the status of a sign from above, Felicity made an effort and staggered from the sofa down to the desk, where the flagon of water was still standing. She poured herself some, splashing some onto the front of her morning gown. When did she change? The memories of what she had done while in the pleasant half-dreaming state were hazy. Well, she must have changed at some point during those long hours, otherwise she would not be wearing the gown now. The irrefutable logic of that statement bolstered Felicity's confidence in her power of thinking returning for good, and she drank some more water. Then she retrieved a thin linen towel from another room and pressed it against the soaked front of her dress. As she did so, the embarrassment over the water stains grew as her consciousness was fully returning. She looked over the assortment of papers upon her desk. A flicker of hope surged in her chest. This was the whole reason she took laudanum, wasn't it? Felicity sat down to read her own writing. After a few minutes, her heart sank. This was, indeed, quite a lot of new lines, but none of them were fit even for reworking, much less publication. Not because the imagery was dull or the metre ill-used. She had mastered both well enough to make use of them, even in the haze. But the subjects of that imagery, just reading them made Felicity's head spin anew. It was not unlike walking through some malicious house of mirrors, the reality distorted. Screaming walls, dark moors, monsters under the bed. She could not use that. She was known for a very particular kind of poetry. Risque, yes, some suggestive imagery, yes, but otherwise smooth as glass. Maidens in flower crowns languishing for dark suitors. This would not do. No, this would not do at all. Felicity felt, for a second, like lowering her head upon her hands and weeping. Her gaze roamed over the room. Something here was not quite right. The source of her disquiet turned out to be a foreign object, a small note lying on the desk. She seized upon it and read it. Dear Felicity, I have found you decidedly unwell, and I hope you are feeling better now. Felicity's cheeks lit up. Edmund had been here? In the lavender cottage he saw her intoxicated? But of course, she realised, she woke up under a blanket after all. Felicity had never been considering enough for herself, even when sober and hale, to stop and pick a blanket up to make herself more comfortable. But Edmund was. For all his stiff ways, for all his past sins. I am afraid certain matters of business are going to take me away from Morwood Hall for a week or more. I'm very sorry that I cannot be by your side in your hour of need. I hope to rectify that once I am back. I hope to see you more often then. I hope you share this wish of mine. I hope you have woken up feeling better. The letter was not signed, which was strange for a man of Edmund's meticulousness. Fear gripped her. What had prompted this decision? What had she done in her delirium? What had she told him? What if she had confessed her secret, her entire, sordid, double life? If she did, Felicity tried to tell herself, Edmund would not have been leaving her courteous notes. The only message he would have left for her would have been an order to get out and never approach the lands around Morwood Hall again. But that could not have been that far in the future. It was like a nightmare unfolding in front of her very eyes, the fabric of reality unravelling. Felicity thought of her mother's imperatives, the lusts of the older man who was holding her future in his hands. She had gotten used to it, numb to it. She had heard sailors travelling in the far northern countries growing similarly numb to the cold around them, as though their bodies morphed into ice. Is that what had happened to her, bit by bit, inch by inch, over those last few years in London? Well, evidently not completely, her inner voice whispered. If you are so hardened and immune to pain after all, why is it that you cannot write any more? She recalled her last conversation with Mr. Flight, that last day in Margate. Plenty of reasonable men would have said that he was merely laying bare what was unspoken before. Besides, what did she expect? When you sell your body for puffs in gazettes, what on earth can you expect but the ceasing of the latter if you stop doing so? But he didn't have to go as far as he did. He didn't have to threaten to pull the strings to make sure the praise for her work dried up in other corners too. You would do that to me anyway once you are tired of me, she had said then, bitter and desperate. That is what happened to Claire Miles, isn't it? Isn't it? Maybe. He had shrugged his shoulders, barely even losing his kindly avuncular appearance. But I am not tired of you yet. Edmund had never been to Margate before. It was not that his family had been indifferent to the newly hailed pleasures of the seaside. When his parents wanted to partake of the healthy sea air, however, they chose the blue-blooded Brighton for their trip, with its fine pavilions and illustrious guests. No one could accuse them of a lack of ambition. Margate was a more modest place, however, and lodgings offered to the travellers did not resemble gargantuan artefacts from some fallen empire. On the other hand, they were much more numerous than anything Edmund had seen in Brighton. His quest was deceptively simple. Walking into one, talking to the owner or owners, asking them if they had seen a lady of a certain description stay here in the year past, and move on to the next. The plan was quite madcap, and Edmund realised that already after the second boarding house he visited. Just how many dark-haired young women, to think of it, have stayed in this popular seaside town since, say, last spring? To him, Felicity, with her heavy black hair and her haunted dark eyes, was a singular creature, something made of quicksilver. To them, however, the tired men and women who took care of well-worn rooms, she would have been just another travelling miss, come to relax among the healthful salty air and the circulating libraries. Edmund's senses were telling him to spend a night in one of the least suspicious lodgings, from the number of those he visited, and turn back tomorrow. There was nothing for him here but the whisper of a woman who had taken too much laudanum. It might well have been that she was simply recalling some unfortunate childhood holiday, space and time collapsing in her head, the years rolling back like a carpet. "They will, Edmund. They will." She might have been referencing her parents, in those days when both were still alive. Edmund tried to reason with himself. After all, what were the chances that she, a real-life woman of flesh and blood, was a victim of some malicious conspiracy, as though she were a heroine of some Gothic novel? But the chance was there. It was puny and pale, but it was there, and it was impossible to ignore. This inn looked as though it had been standing on the farther reaches of Margate since the days of Queen Anne, if not Queen Bess. It was certainly not the kind of place where a woman of means and a taste for life in the light of others' glances would choose to stay. Nonetheless, Edmund went in. "A pretty brunette above 20? The proprietor asked, as doubtfully as at least a dozen of proprietors had asked before him on that rapidly fading day. "Those words fit plenty of ladies." "The woman in question has rather unusual eyes. Very dark, almost black." There might have been someone. "Honey!" he called into the other room. A plump woman entered, holding a book of household ledgers under her arm. "Honey," the owner repeated. "This gentleman wants to know about one of your guests. There was a dark-eyed lady here, I think. You couldn't talk enough about her." "Well, of course I couldn't. Say what you want, but we're a respectable place, and it's not as though I'm stupid. Her wedding ring was cheap, though she was all dressed as if for Almack's. Must have been bought quickly just to make her look decent. But if you ask me—" "I'm not," her husband said quickly. "I am," Edmund interjected. "The woman I am looking for is not married, but if you think that your guest hasn't been a true married woman either—" A sickeningly sordid picture started coalescing in his mind. "She wasn't." "Was she alone?" He knew the answer. Of course he knew the answer. What other answer could there be? Young women didn't buy themselves marriage rings for marriages that never were, just to stay in seaside resorts alone, or with their mothers for company. The answer came like a downward swing of a sword. "No, there was a gentleman with her. They called themselves Mr. and Mrs. Flight." Chapter 12. The light filtering through the leaves of oaks looked different than when it was unfettered. Felicity raised her head and closed her eyes, allowing the shadowed, dappled light to touch her face. She knew, deep down, that she was living on borrowed time. The realization of that had strangled the last shred of willingness to write from her. Nonetheless, she could not help but marvel at the small miracles of nature, at the wide acres and the forests of silver green. She tried her best to banish from her mind the realization that she was going to leave these acres and these forests behind soon enough, this time never to return. She tried to— "Miss Deacon," a familiar voice sounded softly behind her, and she turned, the magic extinguished. Felicity's heart beat faster, not with some love-sickness, for sure, but with dread. The anticipation of a scaffold, which was at times worse than the moment when the blade parted your life from you. "Stop this," she silently ordered herself. "You still don't know for sure. Edmund might have genuinely had things to attend to, something to do with the estate, perhaps. Maybe something to do with his elms." But the fact that he had reverted to the ceremonious Miss Deacon did not speak in support of this notion. "Edmund," Felicity replied, refusing to bow down to this retracing of steps. "How was your journey?"
"It was eventful."
He looked as though he had just got out of the carriage. His hair was mussed, his eyes sleepless as the eyes of a man tossing and turning in hired beds would be. Worst of all, he was looking at her with... no, not with disgust. Not even with disappointment. He was looking at her as though he was seeing her for the last time before her transportation to the place of execution, and wanted to imbibe her whole being with his eyes. Because he knew he was never going to see her again. She decided to be the one to let the axe fall. "Where did you go?" A hesitation, the golden twilight reflecting in his eyes.
"Margate."
"I see."
"Do you?"
Felicity took a step closer. "I know you did not go there for the seaside air," she said quietly. "And you have told Mrs. Winters that your trip was to Bath."
"You know that, too."
A kind of resigned tenderness. "I usually do take care to find out as much as I can about things happening around me."
"Then you cannot fault me for doing the same."
"No, I suppose not. I was a fool taking more of the laudanum than is advisable."
"I am sorry I should not have seen you like that."
"But if you had not, you would not have found out what I truly am. So why the regrets?" She smiled quickly and bitterly.
"For this precise reason, Miss Deacon. Felicity, tell me, have you and Mr. Flight been in a proper kind of relationship?"
"Are you asking me if I am his mistress? I suppose the answer is yes, except..."
"Except?"
"It is more complicated than that."
"Tell me then."
A kind of urgency, a kind of yearning.
"Have you been unwilling? You've said..."
"Of course I was unwilling, Edmund. He is old enough to be my father, and I know your father had been older than your stepmother too, but that is different. Or, at least I dearly hope that is different. Mrs. Winters was a noble-born young woman with an iron wall of protection around her. A dowry, prospects. I had none of this after my father's death."
"Did Mr. Flight promise you literary fame? There, in the beginning?"
"Mr. Flight promised me that I wouldn't starve. Or rather, he promised my mother that we wouldn't. He knew, after all, that he would have to get her blessing. It would not do for a girl as inexperienced as myself to arrange trysts behind her back. I might get caught, after all."
"You were 16.
"Almost 17. I was unwilling at first, but Mother had a rather frank conversation with me. She told me that my hopes of forging my way in the world of letters all by myself was foolish, while Mr. Flight was going to give me connections and assistance and endless puffing in his paper. That, now that Father was gone, and I had no hope of a good marriage any more, after you and your father's decision, I had to support my family by other means."
"Your family, meaning her?"
"Well, it was not as though I myself wanted to starve. I did not want to surrender at first. I was rather foolishly defiant. I did not want to accept that there was only one coin in which a woman can pay for success in this world."
"Surely not the only one."
"The only one that I could find in my purse then." Felicity thought back to that first year after her career was launched, seemingly a blazing comet appearing out of nowhere, the acclaim and the invitations and the trouble sleeping. Not because her guilty conscience troubled her after such a sinful fall, although she knew that was the way moral guardians would have had it, but the curious sensation of her body not being quite hers anymore. It was as though someone cut the threads tethering her true self to it with a knife. Edmund raised his hand and she flinched, every particle of her flesh expecting violence. Instead, he touched her temple, and his fingers drew a wandering line down the side of her face. It was the first time he had touched her like this. Felicity shivered pleasantly under the warmth of his hand. It was also likely to be the last, and she knew it.
"Who is Claire Miles?" he asked. "I recall your reaction when the Cadogans mentioned her. Another poetess from Mr. Flight's list?"
"You are courteous as ever, Edmund. Another man would have said another filly from his stable, and would have been equally right. She was another adolescent genius, another bright comet, one from a decade ago. She burned down like Icarus, some said, just disappeared. They did not know the story behind it was too sordid to bear any resemblance to the Greek gods."
"I would not say so. The dealings of the Greek gods with mortal women were often as sordid as it comes."
"I thought you did not read your Ovid."
"I did, recently."
Her heart twinged at the thought. "After the ball?"
"Before it. 2 weeks after your arrival."
Miss Miles has been ruined by nothing but her patron's desire for someone new, but she blamed me wholeheartedly. I suppose she was not completely wrong. I looked rather down upon her then, with pity. I even thought my taking her place was going to free her. I did not know it was only going to free her into a free fall. I should have guessed."
"I imagine she would have had good savings if her fame was anything like yours."
"If it were anything like mine, she would have had nothing, or almost nothing. I can bet the gown upon my back that she first came to him as poor and unadorned as I did, and just as willing to agree to any conditions and sign any atrocious contract for a chance at an income. I was paid a pittance, while he kept a fine gig and plans to buy a modest country house in Somerset."
"Do you mean he has not only been taking advantage of you, but stealing from you?"
The expression on Edmund's face was almost incredulous. It was as if he could not believe that such low skullduggery could exist in the world. Although, why as if? He had been brought up in the straight-laced and genteel world of the gentry, away from the realm of cutthroat commerce his father had once inhabited, not quite in the dissolute echelons of high aristocracy. The height of dishonourable behaviour he must have witnessed so far must have been a man too tardy to marry his compromised sweetheart. It is hardly stealing. Show our correspondence to any court of law, and they are going to say that my mentor has only been taking what was due to him, that he had been, if anything, too generous with the flighty slip of a girl that I am.
"Hardly."
"No," Felicity cut him off. "Believe me, I have rued my naivety many a time. I have thought of extricating myself this way and that. There is no legal way to do that."
"I am sure there is. If there is, I am going to find it."
Felicity stared at him, dumbfounded. A faint hope flickered in her heart. Was it possible that miracles did happen? That her life was not a bleak cavern after all? You are not disgusted with me?"
"I am disgusted with the people who dishonoured and despoiled a child."
"Hardly a child. Some girls already marry at the age I was back then."
"Yes, and some do not."
"Does it mean," Felicity swallowed, "that I can stay?"
"Of course you can stay. You are my stepmother's honoured guest, after all."
And just like that, the fire flicker of hope had been snuffed out. "An honoured guest, of course."
"Felicity, Miss Deacon,"
he corrected himself hastily.
"I hope you understand. That is, I am sure you understand why I cannot court you now. Why I cannot think of making you my wife."
"Because I am a wanton, disorderly creature."
"Because there will be talk. Felicity, if it had been merely your station in life, your need to earn your bread, I would have disregarded it all, I promise, I would have. But what you have told me, if there are rumours and Mr. Flight does not seem the kind of man to keep his tongue behind his teeth when pressured—"
"I imagine invitations to good houses would dry up rather quickly."
"Yes."
Felicity could not quite keep a touch of bitterness from her voice. Her self-control had never been perfect, and now it was, if anything, run ragged.
Everything my father has built, everything he has dedicated his life to.
Your father's shadow again. I can almost see it here on the forest floor stretching between us.
Felicity, I beg you to understand. I am going to help you as much as I can. I won't leave you trapped in this horror.
Edmund Winters turned away and took a few steps. Fresh leaves were soft under his feet and made not a sound. Felicity stared at him, at his figure outlined in the golden glow of the setting sun, made all the darker by the light. He paused on the edge of the clearing. He turned his head back to her as though pulled by some invisible thread.
I beg you to understand,
Edmund repeated. His voice pained.
There are some things a gentleman simply cannot do.
The room in Felicity's inn was filled with her heavy trunks. She stared at them, feeling a belated guilt over abandoning Mrs. Winters' hospitality so abruptly. The kindly woman, after all, had little notion of what passed between Felicity and her stepson, and no notion at all of the reason for its ending. If Felicity was so set on leaving Morwood Hall then and there, she should have... No, not explained to Mrs. Winters the truth, perhaps, but at least invented a polite and plausible lie. It was too late for that now. The only thing Felicity could do was to write a letter. The only thing she now had the ability to write, it seemed like. She closed her eyes for a second. Claire, Mr. Flight, her mother. As soon as they realised that they had squeezed her dry, they were going to pounce on her like wild cheetahs. She could show none of this, of course. As far as Mrs. Winters was to be concerned, she, Felicity, had merely left Morwood Hall so abruptly because of her poor ageing mother's health, and she had left it for the settled prosperity awaiting her in the capital. She sighed and put pen to paper. Chapter 13. Edmund's logic was simple. If Mr. Flight was looking to buy a small country house in Somerset, it stood to reason that he would cultivate the acquaintance of local grandees. It might even be that one of them might know whom the newspaper proprietor borrowed the money for the house from. That he had indeed borrowed from somewhere, Edmund had not a shadow of a doubt. He knew something of that world, the churn and the dregs of finance, if only because his father had been born and bred there. He knew that practically no man of fashion, be he a journalist or a duke, lived according to his means and avoided debt entirely. Indeed, that was one of the reasons he, Edmund, had always avoided the world in question. The depth of the countryside might not have been without its deprivations and cruelties, but it lacked this deceptiveness of a soap bubble surface. That is, he had avoided it until today. Now he had little choice. Or rather, there had been a kind of a choice: abandon Miss Deacon to her doom, or do something morally unpleasant to get her out. To him, there was no choice at all.
I have to commend your bravery, I suppose, Mr. Winters, Sir Jonathan told Edmund as the latter was admitted to the withdrawing room. Most men would not have dared to call upon the man whose daughter they had spurned publicly.
I would have apologised for that, Sir Jonathan, had I regretted it for a second.
Your daughter had treated my guest with undeserved cruelty. Your guest, is it? People are calling her otherwise. People would have little cause to do so soon enough. Miss Deacon departed Morwood Hall yesterday. She is very unlikely to return. I see. I do hope you have not come here to attempt to renew your courtship of Priscilla. I am sure that whatever measure of sense your father had passed down to you would tell you that that is a hopeless venture. With all due respect, Sir Jonathan, that is not what I have come here for. No, I am all ears. Is the name of Mr. Anthony Flight familiar to you? Great God, Mr. Winters, how on earth do you know such a man as that? I suppose the answer to my question is yes. It is, but I am rather curious. He is notably below you in every way there is. That must have been quite something for Sir Jonathan Cadogan to admit, that there was indeed someone on earth below the young man he thought to be so unworthy of his daughter. But right now Edmund was not in the mood or the place to ponder the intricacies of Sir Jonathan's psyche. He has been threatening a friend of mine. How on earth did he gain leverage upon a man of your circle?
I have different people in my circle.
It seems our circles must be much more different than I had ever suspected. Much different indeed, I suppose. I know that Mr. Flight had been recently borrowing money for a house in Somerset. I wonder if you happen to know the name of the one, or those he is indebted to. I might. Shameful as it is for me to admit, me and the man you are talking about might have shared one or two creditors in the past.
Edmund must have stared noticeably, for Sir Jonathan replied, not without some irritation.
Don't look at me so, Mr. Winters. You are a young man still, and childless. Educating a son is a great expense, and bringing a daughter out is not a cheap undertaking either.
But Edmund could not quite stop thinking. So that was what the old-fashioned magnificence of Sir Jonathan's household rested upon. His feudal hospitality, of which he was so proud, had been as dependent on the exchange of cash under an interest rate as any sea voyage or another mercantile endeavour that the Cadogans would have openly despised.
Could you give me the name of those creditors? What are you intending?
It's quite simple, really. I am planning to buy Mr. Flight's debts from him.
All in the sake of revenge for that friend of yours?
Not revenge. Edmund shook his head. I am not hot-blooded enough for revenge. Insurance.
They are likely to demand great sums for those great debts.
Then I am going to pay them great sums. Felicity knew what to expect when she crept in back home like a thief. Surely enough, her mother greeted her with her arms folded across her chest, and her expression that of a statue made of stone.
"May I ask what you are doing here?"
Mary Deacon asked her daughter, eyebrows raised. There were complications. I had to cut my visit to Morwood Hall short, and
"You have made a mess of things once again!"
It was a statement as definite and final as the last sentence of a judge. It wasn't my fault. Felicity found herself being forced into a defensive position, her voice thinning to the tinny sound of her childhood. Mr. Winters found out about the arrangements we have made with Mr. Flight, and God, there was so much she had not told her, for good reason. She did not want whatever tentative understanding had been blossoming between her and her childhood friend to be sullied by her mother's interpretation, even via letters. He gave me to understand that he would like to cease our courtship. The blow came without warning, like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. 1 second, Felicity was standing, unbent. The next, she was clutching her flaming cheek, skin stinging.
"You have acted like a fool, in other words. A courtship! You could have been a gentry bride by now, then, our position assured, and it was all ruined because of your inability to keep your secrets.
He knew about Margate, Mother. He found out about that.
Then you should have denied it all. Heavens above, do you not have a crumb of womanly wit in your head, Felicity?"
It looks like I don't, Felicity replied quietly. Have you at least written something while in Somerset? Felicity thought of Claire Miles, and how unlikely she was to be paid what she demanded now. A kind of doomed glee rose in her heart. It was the feeling of a man going down with a sinking ship, but knowing that his enemies were going to end up with Davy Jones, just as he himself was. At least, once Claire sent her no doubt luridly embroidered story to the papers, while she, Felicity, was going to end up in a workhouse or worse, her mother was very unlikely to fare much better. The public was not kind to fallen women, but it did not love ladies who pushed their unmarried daughters into men's beds for their own gain, either. I am working on something.
In other words, you've not finished anything.
No, Mother, I have not.
What am I to do with you?
Mary Deacon sighed. Her features softened, and she looked, for a second, very much like the sweet and tired mother of her 2 wild offspring whom she thought herself to be. It was like a glimpse into a past that never was, but where one would have dearly liked to return. That was the reason Felicity offered her a reassuring smile, or at least tried to. She did not succeed. Chapter 14.
The letter was not the easiest to write. It was not every day that Edmund Winters found himself threatening proprietors of literary newspapers, or anyone. But that day it was as though something unseen had steeled his resolve and propelled him down the lines. To Mr. Anthony, Flight. I trust this letter finds you in good health. It is most likely that you do not know my name. I am, however, extremely well acquainted with yours. I am also well acquainted with your plans, with your prosperity of the last years, and with the means with which you have achieved this prosperity. Moreover, I know the men you borrowed money from. I imagine you would be rather shocked by my frank reference to such transactions. There is no need. As any man of property in our corner of Somerset would tell you, my father earned his fortune in the world of commerce, instead of inheriting it from the previous generation, as, according to their opinion, a gentleman ought to do. I have always considered myself my father's son, if not always in this aspect. Both men you have arranged your loans from have recently agreed to allow me to buy your debts. I have all the papers confirming it, and I can call in the debts in question any day, which is what I am planning to do unless we come to an agreement. I do not want your money, for I have my own. I also have no literary ambitions, and anyhow I don't think I could satisfy the main requirements of what you are looking for from those you make into lions of the letters, namely being young, vulnerable, and female. The only thing I am going to demand of you, for make no mistake, it is indeed a demand, is justice. I know of the nature of the unofficial agreement between yourself and Miss Felicity Deacon. You are going to release her from the agreement in question on the day this letter reaches you, and not a week later. You are also going to pay her the sums you neglected to pay her for all the years when she made your fortune, for she had indeed made your fortune. I foresee your arguments. First of all, it is a great sum, I am sure it is. I would even argue that it is rather the point. Second, the financial affairs of several years are always hard to disentangle. If so, I can lend you the services of my steward. I cannot promise that the results are going to be pleasing to you, but they will be accurate. At this point, you would likely ask if I am quite finished with my requests. My answer would be that I am not. I know about a young lady by the name of Claire Miles. I know what happened to her, and what has made her take up the unfortunate trade of blackmail. You stood at the roots of her misery, even though she blames someone else for it. It would be only fair and just if you remedy it. I understand that after you have fulfilled your financial obligations to Miss Deacon, conferring a decent pension on Miss Miles might be difficult. But it is not going to be as difficult as it will be if I call in your debts, which I am going to do, should you fail to fulfill any of my demands. For make no mistake, these are indeed demands. Best wishes, Mr. Edmund Winters of Morwood Hall, Somerset. Edmund's heart was beating fast. One would have said, as though in the heat of a duel, except he had never fought a duel in his whole scrupulous, scandal-free life. He heard soft footsteps of a lady entering the room, and turned his head, perhaps too quickly, too hopefully. He knew of Miss Deacon's flight, and knew that he was most unlikely to ever see the dark-haired poetess again as long as he lived. That would indeed be for the better. Still, he could not quite quiet the hope in him, which was blind and stubborn as a songbird. But of course the woman standing in the doorway was his stepmother. "I received this letter today," Abigail Winters said, holding a simple folded sheet of paper aloft. "Miss Deacon has left our company. Most surprisingly." As she spoke these words, however, her eyes, usually merry, were burrowing tunnels through Edmund's forehead. "We have had a disagreement." "Have you? May I ask about what? Pray tell me you did not argue about Homeric influences in Virgil." "There isn't much to argue about. Now that I've read the letter, I agree with her that there is little in Virgil but Homeric influences." "Such jesting is most unlike you. This is a private matter, mother." "I would hardly be a good mother
If I left my son to stew in his own grievances, please, Edmund, tell me." She walked over to him and was now standing by the desk. What happened to her?
"I have learned some things that made my courtship of her, let alone my marriage to her, impossible."
He expected his stepmother to be shocked by the fact that such things were thought possible in the first place. Instead, she merely nodded.
"I thought you would be rather surprised,"
Edmund added. "I would have been surprised had I not lived under the same roof as you. I might have been surprised had I not been present at that ball. But as it is, the only thing that surprises me is that you thought me such a ninny-hammer as to miss these things." "What were these things, besides the obvious matter of Miss Deacon's position? Has she murdered someone in the past?"
"Mother,
I am merely offering a version of events."
"She has been taken advantage of by, well, I can scarcely call him a gentleman."
"Good heavens!"
"Good heavens, indeed. That sordid liaison, though she did not want it, continued for years, with her mother's abetting."
"But you said she did not want it."
"She did not. But that is not the interpretation most people are going to settle on."
"They might never know."
"Affairs, they leave traces like trails of wild beasts. I have found one. Someone might find another, or even stumble upon the same. Mother, I hope you realize. This is all for our family's sake. I would help her, of course I would. But how can I marry her?"
"But you want to."
"It does not matter what I want. It never did."
"This is the direst sentence I have ever encountered, and I have read most of Anne Radcliffe's novels."
"If I do, it might mean our ruin. I know you have enjoyed Miss Deacon's company, but—"
"They won't take our money away." Abigail shrugged.
"I mean the ruination of our position in the eyes of the world."
"Since when do you care about the world? You have fought most valiantly against even receiving guests."
"I care about my father's legacy." There was an excruciating pause.
"Do you know," his stepmother finally said, breaking the silence like a wall of glass, "some country on the continent, I cannot quite recall which one, has this expression about trying to be holier than the Pope in Rome."
"I have never been particularly pious, Mother."
"I think you understand it is merely an expression. Your Pope is your father, has always been, and your particular piety is your notion of how the world ought to work."
"The notions most gentlemen of sense, including him, share."
"Edmund, how do you suppose my family took the news of his courting me all those years ago?"
"Excuse me?"
"Before I married your father and became the second Mrs. Winters, how do you suppose my family reacted to the notion of a man who made his fortune in trade intending to marry their blue-blooded daughter?"
"Not without consternation, I suppose."
The thought had only come into his head right now. It was peculiar, but although he used to bristle at the notion of his father remarrying, he had grudgingly approved his choice of a bride, an earl's daughter, no less. Edmund had never thought to look at the situation from the other side of the looking-glass, as it were, and ask himself how did the earl in question react to his daughter becoming a plain Mrs. Winters. To some extent, he was excused by the fact that the marriage took place while he, Edmund, was at Oxford. When he came home to Morwood Hall for good, it was to a settled routine of a fashionable married couple, not to the drama of a courtship. But only to some extent. At this his stepmother laughed, her laughter soft and silver. "Not without consternation. You do have your father's gift for understatement, Edmund. My parents had been aghast. Now, had I been as rule-bound as you, I would have doubtlessly complied with their wishes and married a peer of their choosing. As it was, however, I persisted in my obstinacy until your father's proposal was finally, grudgingly, approved by mine. Your father did not live for long after, to my great sorrow. But in the years we were married, I had been as happy as a woman can be."
"That was rather different. If I marry Miss Deacon—"
"God above, Mother, do you realize what it is going to mean for our standing?
It is not only me who had become a laughing-stock of the county, it is you, too."
That was an old argument, a tired argument, one that had been running through his brain since the night of the ball. So tired it was, so close to being discarded, that bringing it out now seemed almost disingenuous. Still, Edmund supposed, it was an argument that his stepmother would understand better than any other. I know that. I would have lied if I said that I liked the prospect. But to be frank, I like the concept of sharing house and home with your miserable countenance for the rest of my existence even less. God knows, she added impishly, you are not an easy man to live with even when your soul is in the state of perfect equanimity. What if the word of her past gets out? Edmund said, feeling curiously helpless, as though he was a shipwrecked traveller clutching onto a raft. Then make sure it does not. If you would be Miss Deacon's husband, it would be your duty to protect her, would it not? Is it not the duty of any husband? Of course, I would never neglect my duty, whomever my wife may be. What do you suppose it is the point of this duty if it is never tested? How many women in our circle truly need some great protection from something in their lives? But she does. So give it to her. I will free her from the scoundrel's grasp if that shall be the last thing I do, but do you love her, Edmund? His stepmother asked bluntly. I do, he replied after a pause. 2 words, but momentous to his own ears, like a sigh from a stone. Then marry her. Do you suppose I was blind during the summer ball? You didn't speak like an automaton of the sort some German courts are fond of then. You spoke like a human being in love. You have snubbed the most eligible bride in Somerset for her. A man who only pursues his dreams halfway and stops before the first obstacle is not called a soul of propriety, he is called a coward. I might be the silly, flighty creature you think me to be, but I know this. You have to go after her. Or one day some lady would take your hand and find out that your flesh really has turned to cold ivory. Chapter 15. Felicity did not leave her room for a long time. She knew it would be only for the better. Every knock on the door roused ghosts of ruin in her head. That unwanted rapping on wood must have been some worried friend or gloating enemy, come with a scandal sheet to inform her of her downfall. Felicity imagined her mother's expression change when the inevitable news came, and the vision elicited in equal parts thrill and fear in her. Was it likely to end badly for Felicity herself? Certainly. But so would a fire in this house that killed both of them, and it was not as though Felicity was not fantasizing about such a disaster now. Whomever it was there beyond the threshold, he or she refused to go away. Their knuckles must have been bleeding by now. Felicity swallowed. There was no point postponing the catastrophe. She called for the maid to open the door. A shuffle of footsteps, a breath of autumn. Summer was well and truly over now. "Miss Deacon," the maid called out, "there's a gentleman to see you." Felicity's heart skipped a beat. It could not be Anthony Flight, could it? God in heaven above, please let it not be Anthony Flight. There were challenges, quite a lot of challenges lately, she did not feel herself equal to. Felicity went into the small parlour and froze. "Edmund?" she asked, forgetting herself, forgetting the proper address they had returned to in that sun-dappled clearing. "What are you doing here?" Had she had any self-control left, she would have asked something more oblique, for example, if he is in London for long. But she had none of it left. In truth, she had had very little left of anything. "Felicity." He did not bother to sit, and stepped toward her as soon as their eyes met. "I have come to make things right." "What do you—" Felicity did not finish the sentence when Edmund Winters grasped her hands in his. She heard the maid's shocked, indrawn breath behind her, and footsteps from the corridor, but could not bear to pay attention to either. "Felicity Deacon," the master of Morwood Hall whispered, looking in her face as though it were the sun, and he the reckless Icarus. "Will you make me the happiest man on God's green earth by becoming my wife?" "Do you truly mean this?" "Of course." "But nothing has changed. I am still a danger to your standing.
Among whom? Among people like the Cadogans? God, but that would be a meagre loss.
I am penniless.
No longer. Mr. Flight chose a partial ruin over the greater one.
What do you mean? Edmund's face shone like a boy's, as though they were children again, fresh from some imagined victory over a great dragon.
He has agreed to pay you what is owed to you. He would have agreed to far more, to be honest, just to avoid debtor's prison. I've checked the accounts after my steward did, and it seems you are quite a wealthy woman now, Felicity. Your dowry is nothing to be sneered at. I've promised to protect you, haven't I?
Yes, you have. I didn't believe you would. I didn't believe anyone would.
I would for the remainder of our lives, if only you—
Of course she agrees, Mary Deacon exclaimed, standing in the doorway. Mother, Felicity muttered, please don't. Of course she does, the older woman repeated, her smile bright and her gaze directed at her daughter vicious. She's not a fool after all.
Mrs. Deacon, Edmund said coldly, it has been a long time since I saw you last.
You have changed so much.
And you not at all. I know about your enterprise, Mrs. Deacon.
I cannot imagine what you mean.
I think you can. I would also tell you one thing. I could have said that if your daughter accepts me, I would try to be a better protector to her than you were, but that would be setting the bar shamefully low.
Mr. Winters! Mary Deacon's cheeks flamed with indignation under the fine powder. I don't know what Felicity told you, but I have always held her well-being close to my heart.
You have always held your own well-being close to your heart.
Felicity's chest flooded with warmth, and not a little glee, as she heard her mother's feeble protests. If Anthony Flight was her dragon, her mother had been its servant and go-between. And now the man she had loved since she was but an adolescent had vanquished them both. Felicity, Mary Deacon demanded, you cannot possibly be standing here, silent as a mule, and say nothing against such a treatment of me. Oh, you are right. I cannot, and will not. I will say something, indeed. Felicity gave her a smile as cold as her own, an unsettling, sharp mirror. I will not marry Edmund Winters in order to give you a route to the splendid life you have always thought yours by right. I will marry Edmund Winters because I love him, because he is a man of great decency and noble intentions. You are not going to be welcome in Morwood Hall, or indeed at our wedding. I will leave you the effects in this house, and a modest pension that would keep you from the rookeries. You have sold me, like a harem girl, to keep yourself in good stockings. I think it would be fitting if now you will live knowing you do not starve on the street only because I will it. For a second, Felicity wondered if she had gone too far, if such a display of a vengeful nature would make Edmund reconsider his great proposal. But instead she felt his hands press hers closer. Felicity turned back to Edmund and smiled. I will marry you, she repeated. I hope it will indeed make you the happiest man in the world. If not, I would have done something amiss. Should the mantua-makers of Bath and London be too scandalised by me, she added, I know a wonderful woman in the village closest to Morwood Hall who would do our wedding justice. Epilogue. Felicity Winters was slightly out of breath as she climbed over a hill. I would never understand how you managed to walk this valley so easily, she breathed, looking at her husband, who was waiting for her on the top. He offered her his hand, palm up, and she gratefully grasped it, as tightly as though she were a drowning woman. But she was not drowning. Not any more.
It is mostly a matter of habit, Edmund told her.
The sun was bright upon his face. Felicity could predict that only his forehead, shadowed by the hat, was going to remain white by this new summer's end. Then let us hope I am going to earn this habit soon enough.
I know you will. You train yourself into everything you put your mind to. You always have. Energetic rambling should not be harder than all those other matters.
It is certainly easier than household ledgers. I cannot understand how ladies born and bred manage to run such estates.
By being born and bred to them, mostly, Edmund replied. They were now strolling over thin, pale paths through the unclaimed grass. I hope your steward is skilful indeed, for I would not want Morwood Hall to go to ruin by the time our future children will come of age. The steward is skilful. Edmund put one hand upon her waist and turned her to face him, and the wife is clever. With these words, he kissed her soundly. For a few seconds the world was gloriously still, frozen like a butterfly in amber. Then Felicity laughed. Do be careful. What if someone spies us? It then shall be known that Mr. Winters is now consumed by a scandalous passion for his own wife. It would hardly be more scandalous than our marriage. With these words he pressed his lips to the corner of her mouth. Some kind of guilt twinged in her heart. I dearly hope you won't regret the fact. Why would I, God above? I can live without invitations to hunt balls. Felicity thought back to their winter wedding. The world, virginal in white, herself in a modest gown of blue muslin. While they walked back from the church, Felicity stepped very carefully along the paths, as though a careless touch that could break the surface of the snow could break her fragile future too. But nothing of the kind happened. The small procession reached the house without further adventures. The wedding breakfast was a quiet affair, lacking crowds from both his side and hers. To be fair, Felicity and Edmund both were rather glad of it. It had been tacitly agreed between them that, if she were now to pay for the expense of her publications, and as Mrs. Winters she could now well afford to, it would lend her the independence of creating she craved, and was deprived of for so many years, and for such a great price. Privately, Felicity suspected she would recoup the investment well enough, for if scandal closed some doors in the upper echelons of society, it made other things sell like hot cakes at Bartholomew Fair. She did not write throughout this winter. The wound that gaped within her still needed time to mend, even now that the venom had been drawn out. She was sleeping, healing, walking with her husband arm in arm through the great white silence of the countryside, day after day. Something shifted in the spring, if not quite on the very same morning when Felicity jumped out of bed, ran to the window, opened it herself as though she lived in a farmer's cottage, and laughed at the April sunshine that soaked her top to toes. The air was tinted with lilies of the valley. I'm trying to write something new, Felicity said now, and swallowed as the last word left her lips. Well, something at least. Anything at all. Tell me. It is going to be something like the Roman pastorals, in a manner of speaking. Not that I am comparing myself to Virgil or my scribblings to his Georgics, but— She halted and had to find her bearing again. But find it she did. Do you remember I told you about Abgrund, the great chasm? It's hard to forget, given the circumstances. Yes, I suppose. Well, I'm writing something that might be a farewell kiss to all those great chasms. An ode to these hills, to these woods, to that one chapel despoiled in King Henry's day. We shouldn't have visited it in March. Its beauty is far greater in summer. I think it was rather— Right, in March. The cold light, the stained glass, the jagged walls. It might not be as sweetly beautiful as a flower is beautiful, but it is something sublime. Felicity fell silent as Edmund touched her lower lip, stroking it wonderingly with his thumb. Something once abandoned and broken, but sublime? Isn't it rather prideful to be writing an ode to yourself? He teased her, and her cheeks lit with heat that had nothing to do with the sunlight. It is not an ode to myself, or at least I did not plan it this way. It is going to be an opening poem in a collection about this place. Felicity stroked the nape of his neck, unable to resist the temptation of slight tickling, despite the earnest subject at hand. Or rather, about our home. This is Mary Jane Wells. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of A Poetess and an Heir by Anne Hawthorne,
Presented by Anne Hawthorne. Text copyright 2023 by Anne Hawthorne. Production copyright 2023 by Anne Hawthorne. All rights reserved. Thank you for listening.